Hi, and welcome to another episode of Kasper On BI. Today I'm excited to talk about data mesh. What is data mesh? We've all heard about it, we've seen it online, customers are starting to implement it, but to me it's not that tangible yet. What is data mesh? What does it give us, especially if you look at it from the Power BI standpoint? So today I'm excited to talk to Paul Andrew. And Paul is a technical architect at Avanade. He's a data platform MVP. And as such, he's talked to a lot of customers about the architecture and what their goals are. And he's been running a lot of blogs and sessions on data mesh in Azure. So with that, let's go listen from him what it is and learn more about it. So let's go to the episode. Hi, Paul. Honored to have you here. A very exciting topic. I am pretty excited. I'm reading and listening to podcasts about it, and found your blog talking about data mesh, and especially in the world of Azure, where I live, of course, and Power BI. So but maybe for people who do not know you yet, can you do a little bit of introduction, what you do and where you work?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Kasper. Yeah, thanks for having me. I depending on how far you want to go back and how much you choose to date all of the grey hair on my head, but I
Join the
think
club.
I could say now, yeah, I could say now I've been in the data space for sort of 15 plus years. I started life very much as an on-premises BI developer. I loved the complete SQL Server stack. And then, of course, everything became a lot more cloud orientated. And I think I've been using some of the Azure data products ever since they existed in a lot of cases. And now applying that trade as a consultant. And my job title is now technical architect for Avanade. So I get to go and play with a lot of enterprise customers and design and deliver data platform solutions for them. So
Cool.
yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, and I think, like you, yeah, have a bias towards the Microsoft technology.
Well, yeah. For me, it's easy because I work there. But yeah. But and so you were always so you started out as a data guy. So always working in the data world.
No, not always actually. When I was still being educated, I actually studied electronic engineering, and
Ah,
I'm actually qualified to do portable appliance testing. So no, I wasn't always a data person. But I started life certainly within the IT industry on a service desk, very much first line support. So
mm,
I came from the trenches in that sense, and then through that role ended up creating reports for my customers of the software they were using at the time, and then found SQL, and then obviously started enjoying writing that. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
yeah, that was I think that was where I first got my data bug. That obviously through SQL I could answer questions about a company and about what they were doing a lot more effectively than they necessarily understood themselves. Which yeah, it was that question answer problem solution of what data gave me that I enjoyed, which is where I got my bug, I think. Yeah, and
yeah,
of
yeah.
course then through grey hairs and experience, I now get to design the solutions, not just write the code to answer the questions from that data.
Well, that's really cool. So let's talk a little bit about data mesh.
Yeah.
So I came across. I mean, obviously we know each other for quite a long time, but I came across your blog post when you were started talking about data mesh. I don't know, like a couple of months ago, beginning of the year or something, or it's something like this. You started I think it's 7 blogs long by now, and you also have a talk about it.
Yeah, I delivered a talk on at SQL Bits in March of this year. I The session title I gave it was an evolution of data platform architectures, and
Mm,
then the subtitle I said, well, we've got Lambda, Kappa, Delta, and Mesh, just to try and sort of give a bit of a thought-provoking view on what that talk was about. Because really through my career, this is what I've seen. I've seen this evolution of architectures, and data mesh is now very much the latest version of that, and that latest evolution. So yeah, I've been blogging about it now, very much thinking about that theory that's been offered to us via Zhamak and what she's brought to the table with her experience, and then how me as an architect for my customers can actually apply those principles and apply it to solutions that they want to build in Azure. And I blog about it as a way to get my thoughts in order
Yeah,
because
yeah,
these things are they're all very new, and I think it's good to figure things out together. And obviously, through the very open industry that we have, which is great, I can blog about it. I can get the opinions of the wider community, which obviously then helps me and helps our customers. And yeah, we get to learn and grow together. So yeah, I've been blogging about it to get my own thoughts in order, and obviously great to talk to you about it as well for the same reason.
yeah, yeah. And then that's the best way. Let's go back because this is the data mesh is a term we're starting to hear more and more. A lot of people getting excited about it.
Yep.
Last week I had an episode with ABN AMRO Bank. They implemented something like this, so it is really good to see. But right now, it is a concept or a theory, or it's like I kind of see it like evolution of like Kimbal in a certain way, but larger than what Kimbal is really focused on, like actual implementation on like, okay, here's how you do dimensions, here's how you do facts, and this is more of a concept on around like governance and giving data to people. So it's not that you can just take the book. Like you were showing me the book earlier, and I'll put the link in the description because it's a really a good book. I read it too. Uh, yeah, and she really made a really interesting pitch towards more. And again, this really echoes well with anyone who works with Power BI and who wants self-service BI for their business users. So it's really a concept, but it's not like you can take the book and just implement it because, I mean, first of all, the tools are not working in the same way that they wanted to work. I mean, I saw some of their ThoughtWorks, I think is their company that they also work in. Some implementations using Azure on, and they had some struggles with it. But I mean, this is where we are today. So maybe for those who don't know, and I'm going to ask you, what is data mesh?
Yeah, big question.
Yes.
So I think building on that evolution that yeah we're mindful of and where we've come, I think now to try and answer that question of, well, what is it? The starting points that for me what I found, and I'm sure anybody will find if they search for it, will be the four principles of a data mesh architecture, which is data as a product, having domain orientated decentralized data ownership is important, having that federated computational governance, and having that self-service data infrastructure as a platform. So if we start with those four principles, which on their own are massive areas to try and understand and try and figure out.
Yeah.
So to try and break it down, what I've been doing to try and understand it and unpick it and indeed apply it is to, because I'm very simplistic. I think about, okay, fine, let's think about it as input, process, and outputs. Let's maybe even call it extract, transform, and load, if you like. But however we want to try and break that down. So I think about, well, if we're going to think about our data as a product, what does that look like? And actually, in the latest part of my blog post, I've started to try and define what is a data product. Because once we start thinking about that data as a product, I think that really helps us. And I try and break it down and looking at what the technical capabilities are that we're trying to achieve, what the requirements of that data are, and then what is the business driver for it, or what sits within that data domain. So I think once we start trying to classify and think about the data that we want in that way, it certainly helps us a little bit with getting towards what we want to build. And then to try and maybe flip it to more of the practical side. For
Mm.
me, when I now think about data as a product in Azure, for my customers, I say, well, let's try and encapsulate that data product into an Azure resource group, and let's build it in there. And I then say, well, let's add in that layer of the data domain. And I like to think about that as a hierarchy of the data domain at the top level and then the data product within it. So I will use an Azure subscription at the data domain level and the data products within it. So an easy example would be a data domain of people. And within that data domain of people, we could of course have HR data, we could have payroll data, we could have sickness and absence and holiday data, all of these things that might relate to a person. So
Hmm.
we could then build those data products within it. And to your point about a Kimbal style warehouse of facts and dimensions, we could say that any question that we want to try and find an answer from, in the way that we're modeling that data, we could say, well, that then becomes our data product. It's very much subjective, and I
But
think it's
again,
hard to try
so
and find.
so you before you were talking about, like, let's take this example, like, you talk about hierarchical data. I can imagine, and I think this is one of the things I really like about this data mesh is, if I'm a data scientist, I don't care about the data warehouse. I just want to look. I would just want to run machine learning algorithms against the data that's sitting in the lake. But if I'm a BI guy and I'm just opening up my Power BI desktop and I want to do some data, I want to look at that data mart or data set or whatever we want to call it, uh, or even a report creator that wants to work on the data set. So, like, this domain of data is multiple different levels, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's multiple levels, and that's kind of just the first way to try and break down that question of, well, what is this data mesh? It's like separating out that domain and data product first, and I think if you can make that shift and are comfortable with that, it helps. But then, the other principles of the mesh is about understanding, well, how do we serve that data and how do we make it available? And then it's about how does the platform support us in doing that? What's the DevOps story that sits behind it? And I think there's all of this other good stuff that goes into delivering this data mesh architecture. I think it's about that frictionless ability to onboard that new data, make it available through the product and within that domain, and then serve it out to the people that want it. Because of course, if those people can't get that insight, they can't get that output from that data, then you
Yeah.
you lose all that business value in it. And well, what's the point? Because if we want to be data driven and we want to use that data, so I think the output obviously is very crucial in here, which is why I like this set of principles within this architecture, because it's not just about the inputs and the process, it's very much about how we deliver that output as well.
So, and let's make, I also, I think, similar to you, try to make things a bit more concrete. So, we've had all these concepts before about data warehousing and data lakes and data lake houses. And I mean, nothing of this really changes with data mesh. It is just the way that we, like, make it, right? Or how do we fill it? So, okay, so we have a data lake house that's still there. All the data lake is still there, but we're making areas into that lake house, and probably, like, thinking about it, I'm old school BI guy, old school ETL guy. So we're loading data into the lake. Okay, it's just raw format. And after that, we'll start making those product domains. Is that the way to see
Yeah,
it?
I think yeah, that's a good way to start. And like you, I'm old school as well. So I think doing that as a starting point, but then what the mesh is then trying to deliver for us as well is that scalability and that decentralization. So, it's okay to have many data products and many different data domains, and
Hmm.
maybe they all have their own data lake, and they all work
Yeah.
very much independently, but they subscribe to this set of principles, and they subscribe to this consistency within this mesh architecture, which means that they can then do things, and they get the advantages of this platform that's there while they're still doing their decentralized work, which means we can scale out, if you like, in terms of the data product delivery, but through this framework of onboarding them into the mesh. So it means that they get the advantages of the platform that's already there. And then indeed the users on the receiving end, the data consumers, get the same advantages as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's more than just throw everything in a data lake. It's that decentralization to it as well, which I think is crucial.
So, okay, let's be devil's advocate here, because this is the discussion we've had for years with Power BI side too. Like, okay, decentralized self-service, this kind of feels that way too. A lot of IT organizations will start asking, okay, well, I, I want to be in control. Where does data go? And I think maybe this goes back to one of the principles too about the governance, like lineage and stuff like this, and how to govern it is super important there too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same conflict because, when do we centralize? Because we want to from a governance perspective, and when do we decentralize in order to increase scale? So yeah, I definitely feel that same conflict. And I don't have a good answer, I think, at this point. I think the the domain orientated ownership is a good starting point. So we're not reliant on a single data steward that controls and governs everything. So I think having those domain owners is important. People that are specialists in that particular area of the data that they're working with.
Mm.
So yeah, I think, and this is perhaps where maybe the technology doesn't quite align with the principles at this point. We can, of course, separate the people and have different domain owners and things like that, but does the technology lend itself to the same model? And within this mesh, who actually is authoritative over a particular data domain, if there is indeed overlap as well? I think I put a similar statement in my very first blog post when I was figuring this out and being very skeptical as well, playing devil's advocate. How do we avoid that data duplication if multiple products need the same data set? Who decides who's the authority of it? So I think it's both a people problem and a technical problem, and maybe a business problem as well.
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, it feels very much same as this discussion we've had with Power BI for years. Like, okay, so we're letting loose all these users with their data, but how do we make sure it's the same data? But I think more and more people will start to understand and to grasp, like, okay, with the right governance in place, it's okay, because I mean, there's so much more that we can do with these decentralized self-service data hubs, if you will, than what it would. So maybe, so let's go back. So let's say I'm an organization, okay, and I come to you, and why would I want to have a data mesh architecture? What are my benefits? What am I going to get out of it?
Yeah, I think it's another big and hard question. I think depending on the size of the organization, and I would probably go back and say, well, is this a greenfield project that we're looking at, or is this more of a brownfield implementation, and we're trying to retrofit some of these principles to it? But I think what I would try and say is the main benefit here is that ability to scale, and that ability to onboard new data products and get that data flowing through the architecture and the solution a lot quicker, because we have this established mesh, this established platform, and it
Yeah.
means that we can get the data in the hands of the consumers much quicker than we perhaps did through this set of principles. Which is why I think that the technology and the platform is so critical to get right up front, which is where that bar to entry becomes very high and becomes very hard, because if you're trying to sell this as an idea, of course a business person is going to say, well, where is the value? you can't spend 2 years developing, a perfect platform that does self-service, but not actually have any data flowing through it yet. So
Yeah.
it's a hard one to figure out that roadmap and to figure out that journey of how you get there. And it's actually something that I've agonized over quite recently when it comes to what is a minimum viable data mesh solution.
Mm.
In order to say have that conversation with the business of, well, if we do A, B, and C, we get that critical mass, which means that this thing then gains momentum and we can get there. So it's a hard one. I think it becomes even harder if a business has an established data analytics landscape, as
Mm.
of course a lot of them now do. And you say, well, let's pause all development on your existing analytics solution, and now let's sort of retrofit this set of data mesh principles. It's and at the end of it, you don't actually have anything new. You just have this ability to achieve things a lot faster.
Well,
You
I mean, I
can't
would
quantify
say
that.
that is probably a pretty good one too. It actually
Yeah,
uses,
a
and
good one, but
I think maybe the problem today that I'm seeing, at least, it's definitely harder for a lot of people to get the right data at the right place at the right time. Like, yeah, they have, okay, from data lake to data mart is probably okay, but there's so much more in between these days. Like, you have your data scientists who need to be able to run all kinds of things over the raw data. So maybe, like, if you just start with one domain, you siphon off like some data out of the data lake that you already have existing into an established domain. I mean, I can definitely see that work. So maybe, and I think you kind of already answered it, but going back to traditional data warehousing, how is this different?
so I would think about a traditional data warehouse as a big centralized instance of, where we bring together many different source systems. To be overly simplistic, we bring together 50 source systems into our raw data warehouse area, and then we start enriching and blending that data together. And I think in that scenario, we don't really care about the data domain.
Mm.
We just have a common way of landing that data and making it available. And of course, we then do some data modeling and things on it as well. Where I see this as being different is that instead of maybe 50 source systems all going into one warehouse, we split that apart into the respective data domains,
Mm.
which means we can then sort of scale out that onboarding of data. And once we have that, it means that we can then start blending the data together and getting that output. So for me, that difference from a traditional data warehouse stack, it's about that separation. It's about
Yeah.
achieving that scale in a new way that is now domain orientated.
And actually, one of the I listened to a podcast with the lady. What was her name again?
Jamak.
Shimak. Yeah, I want to make sure that I get the name right. But so they were talking about it, and actually, this resonates really well with me. Like, before I started working in the BI world, I was a developer, like C# and stuff. And before I left that world to go into the BI, this really started this whole architecture of like um, to be able to subscribe to like a service bus. So okay, I just want to get data. Like, in the development world, this has been something that they've been working on for 20 years. Like, I've been in this space for about 20 years, and this is when they kind of started already. Like, okay, instead of building like big databases or whatever it is, we're just going to give you endpoints where you can get data about HR data, or you get endpoint about products, and we're not there yet. And I think this is what's, as you said, the decentralized. It's a good comparison, because that's you can just, okay, I want to get data from HR data from people, I want to get data from sales. They're two different domains. They're not centralized, but I can bring them together in my in my solution.
Yeah, and I think that's where kind of the output side of this becomes so important as well. That self-service capability, not just of the data, but maybe of the the platform and the infrastructure as well. And the way I like to think about it to compare with the theory is those planes that are talked about within that data mesh. Zhamak describes them as the infrastructure plane, the developer experience plane, and then that mesh supervision plane.
Yeah.
So I kind of have a slightly alternative view that I would think about. Sure, the infrastructure plane, infrastructure as a service, absolutely, particularly in Azure. We then have the platform as a service offerings that we get through whatever product we want to use in Azure, and then we have the software as a service plane where our consumers can come in. All those different personas that you talked about, they can use that software as a service plane and as you say, get whatever they want. But I think those interfaces that they use at each of those planes becomes very important as well. Do you expose a set of APIs? Do you expose just a SQL endpoint? And how does that consumer actually access it? Because I think there's obviously a very important set of data cataloging that needs to happen where a user can explore. They don't care about everything that's happened before and how that data has been ingested. They can just browse the catalog. They pick what they want for the question they try and answer, and they bring it together through whatever endpoint they prefer or whatever user interface they prefer. So I think this is kind of part of it as well. What I said earlier about it's not just the input that's important here, it's the output that this mesh architecture and these principles facilitate the understanding of us actually delivering it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that friction goes away. That friction for a consumer getting the answer to the question they want.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so let's take it like okay. So I think I kind of get the value, right? It's easier for consumers, and not just Power BI consumers, but every consumer of data in the organization. And again, it could be developers, it could be data engineers, it could be data scientists, it could be BI developers. All these different people can find the data and get to what they need. So let's talk a bit more concrete. So let's say I'm an organization and I would build something like this in Azure, obviously, because we were talking about Azure and Power BI. What would it kind of look like, and who would own these areas? Because I can imagine there's a landing staging platform where all the raw data comes in. It comes from SAP, it comes from Insight, it comes from real time, whatever. And from there on, it needs to go into those domains. Who owns that, and how does that work?
Yeah, so what I'm still figuring this out as well, I think, and yeah, where the technology meets the theory. So and I think about this in terms of that minimum viable mesh as well.
Yeah.
So I think we start with the platform, Azure in this case. We have our security on our Active Directory, and we have our VNets, our infrastructure, and we have all of that stuff. And we then think about, okay, well, once we've got all of that and we want to onboard some data, we then need to have that almost configuration driven menu of what that data product is going to need and want from ingestion to output. So what we can then think about is our infrastructure as code with what we then want to deliver within that data product. Is it a data lake? Is it Databricks? Is it Synapse? Whatever. And we then allow our users or maybe our data engineers, persona, they're not sure, but we then give them the option to create and deploy an empty data product, let's say. and they deploy it with those resources that they need into their Azure resource group, into the appropriate subscription for the domain that this data is going to belong to. And then, they start iterating and building and delivering it. And through various frameworks, they could ingest that data and bring it into their product. So, that's what I see is happening at the moment. There's probably
And
lots
then,
of other.
so do you have like as an organization, would you say there is like for the data product, like I can imagine it's like there are interfaces. That's how I see it. There needs to be a SQL interface. There needs to be a Spark. You need to be able to run Spark over it. You need to be, and is that optional or is it? So as a company, do you say a data product? I expect these things to be there.
Yeah. And I think that's where it comes to defining that data product is so important, not just from the theoretical, but from that technical capability standpoint. At the infrastructure level, the infrastructure plane within the mesh, we have to have that VNet integration. Therefore, when we deploy a Databricks workspace, we have that VNet integration. So that is a minimum requirement for the data product. The SQL endpoints, that it's a minimum requirement. It could be. Whatever the options are, I think consistency is the important part.
So
So we
the
go
interesting
on.
thing you mentioned too is like code driven. That kind of got me thinking too. So the whole thing is code driven. So let's say you would make a change to the interface. At one point, some new product comes out and we need, I don't know, whatever, new thing added to it. So you could just completely regenerate it based on the base lake or something.
We could regenerate it, or I think we could even treat that new requirement as a new data product that is onboarded separately. I think that's something that I'm still unsure about as well. Is, well, how granular do we go with our data products?
Yeah.
Do we say that a single data set that we want out is a data product, or do we say that you know of those 50 data sources I mentioned earlier, actually 5 data sources are required to make a data product? I think that's an interesting distinction, and maybe it's where we have to be pragmatic and find some middle ground that says, well, this new requirement, we are going to deliver that as a data product. Uh, I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
because the problem obviously is it always changes, right?
It
The
always
business
changes, yeah.
comes always to you a week after you're done. It's like, oh, actually, let me add this or that. I want this. So now you're saying, okay, if it's very rigid, then. But if it's code driven, you just update the code and just roll it out. Downside, obviously, of that is there's time between
Yeah,
when data lands in the lake and and when it lands up into the data product.
yeah. And something that somebody said to me recently as well was that the way to try and think about a data mesh architecture and to think about those data products is to think about what application developers have been doing with microservices for a long time.
Yeah,
The data product is now the microservice of the data world, if you like, within this mesh. So that, yeah, absolutely, that could become throwaway, and we deal with change just by tweak and redeploy, or
mm.
however.
Yeah, and maybe that's another interesting question. So you probably saw on Twitter, I asked some people to, okay, I'm going to talk to Paul on data mesh and some
Yeah.
questions. One of them is, okay, this is all nice and great, but how much more is this going to cost us? Is there anything to say about that?
Well, you maybe I'll say you work at Microsoft. You tell me how much it costs. um, I, Cost is certainly, I think, a challenge. Um, I often say to my customers, what is our primary design focus here?
Mm.
And yeah, I say, is it reusability? Is it rapid delivery, or maybe is it redundancy and disaster recovery? And non-functional requirements. Um, and cost always features in there, particularly in this new sort of OpEx world of Azure and pay as you go, and it becomes a challenge. And I think it becomes a challenge to predict what that cost is going to be, because as we know, once you answer one question from a data set, it will spawn 10 more questions, which
Yeah.
means more compute and more resources, etc. And how do we justify that run cost versus the business value that they're getting from the analytics platform? I think that's a really hard problem. But even more so if we are considering what then becomes throwaway in here. What's throwaway resources and what's throwaway in that platform. It's hard. Is it throwaway because we don't need it anymore, or because it's been archived, or just because we're
I
adding
mean,
something new?
I kind of see it. I mean, similar way when I talk to a lot of big customers that use Power BI today. Even though when they have, for example, an E5, they have pro license for everyone, they still want to buy premium capacities. So they go to their IT, but again, you have to think about the return on investment, and that's probably like today with the traditional architecture, you're very limited in what the output is, and in this new world where, I mean, you have all kinds of different users. You have data scientists and data engineers, and you have so this new you'll get more bang for your buck, but obviously the cost will go up a bit more because you need to have more interfaces. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see, and probably also to land that with customers, because they are more also thinking about it in traditional way, but they will see at one point obviously we have more different types of users, so we need to be more flexible with what we can do.
Yeah, and I think in this mesh landscape that we have, where there are many data products, every data product has, say, an API endpoint and a SQL endpoint that we want to encourage people to come and self-serve and use those endpoints. But of course, in doing that, we're incurring a cost.
Hmm.
Now, is it the consumer that should pay the cost of that API result, or is it the data product that should pay the cost of it?
Yeah.
In which case, if you're a data product owner of a very common data set, your cost is obviously going to be a lot higher than a less common data set. And I think that, yeah, that becomes an interesting one. But
And then so
I
actually maybe that offers me a good question. Like, what about departmental? Like, obviously that's not. I mean, I can imagine that will happen too. Like instead of data products, they will just have a. Okay, yeah, just let me create my own little kingdom.
Yeah, and I think if we think about applying that in Azure with the subscriptions and the resource groups and the tagging and everything that we can do, I think that domain ownership at a subscription level is obviously a very good charging bucket, but then it maybe becomes an admin overhead that you have to recharge some of that consumption cost to somebody else. Maybe
Yeah, yeah.
it's
But
I
but what do you think about that? Like, domains are pretty clear, but they're also again a little bit rigid, right? So let's say I'm a department and I need particular data from HR, I need data from sales. So there are these two domains that I'm not quite sure who owns. Probably IT. Someone in
yeah
IT owns these. So I now need to do things. Why don't I just hire a consultant to come in, get that data directly from the lake, and create my own little kingdom that is not a pure domain? It's my own thing. Uh,
yeah, and I think there's maybe kind of, I feel like there's two parts to that answer, because I agree that the domain could be rigid, but I'm a fan of Venn diagrams, so I see everything as overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. So I see what was it, a person domain and then a sales domain.
yeah.
There's definitely an overlap of those two circles there, and
Mm.
I think that's where collaboration of those domain owners need to agree what goes into that blended data model. That's kind of a people business theoretical approach to it. then when it comes to a technical approach, we need to consider that data virtualization and how that data is going to exist where it does come together.
Yeah.
Because absolutely, do we end up with a separate data product that is people data plus sales data, and
Yeah.
that's a new thing.
I mean, we see today with Power BI, right? Okay, they have all the data sitting available, but they want some changes. Said, okay, screw all this. We're going to just put Excel files in SharePoint and use that as our data source for our deliverable, and everyone is fine with that because it's quicker. But yeah, that's the everlasting struggle, probably.
Yeah, and I mean the people in the governance side of it is definitely one struggle, and then of course what we do in the technical world becomes a struggle as well with that virtualization, because of course as soon as somebody takes data from two different products or two different domains and persists that data into a new data model that somebody else then goes and uses, we almost end up back in the same problem of, well, who is then the authority of this? So I think having that end to end, that federated governance, as it's talked about in the principles of the mesh, becomes so important to
Yeah.
make sure that when somebody consumes the data, it is just consumption. It's not maybe persisted, which then means that we end up with a new sort of authoritative source of it. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, that's what interesting. So where does it end up? It doesn't end up anywhere anymore as a artifact of the mesh. It's outside of it because you're combining things.
Maybe, yeah, and I think something that I've struggled with as well recently from a technical standpoint is when we talk about data virtualization across all of the products that exist within that mesh, is that virtualization service or whatever, is that a product within the mesh as well? Is that, do we have we talk about domain ownership. Do we have a data analytics domain that is owned? And then are we really just centralizing around a data warehouse in the same way that we have been? And I think we definitely end up chasing our tail a little bit. And I think this is where we need to be careful.
Maybe we don't need to define everything as much yet. I mean, I think the principles are amazing. Getting the right data at the right time, at the right format, that is something that is missed today. So that's definitely really good. So maybe take one step back. So let's say I'm a company and I come to you and I say I want this approach. Well, first of all, probably no one will come to you yet asking for data mesh. No one will ask you, okay, can you come and give me Kimbal? Probably, I don't think so. But when do you think this would be interesting for a business, and how would you tell them to go about it?
That's a hard question. I think another thing that I struggle with, and I'll be very open with your audience, that is a data mesh architecture only for an enterprise customer? Does a small and medium business need a data mesh architecture? Are they at that level of scalability where they need it? I think is it again something that I'm not sure on the answer to, but depending on the size of that business, I'd say, well, what does their data journey look like so far?
Yeah.
What have they implemented so far, and how have they gone about it?
I mean, probably means probably the biggest question is how many different types of data sources do they have? Like if you just have your CRM application or whatever it is, you have like two applications, then you're not going to think about data lakes anyway. But I think for those people who are thinking about data lakes and landing, and we see a lot of customers do this, like SAP. I mean, they're landing all of that data into the lake because now they can start doing a lot of things extra with it. For those customers, probably this is something they should at least think about.
Yeah, and I think maybe to try and answer my own question of that small to sort of enterprise business, where do you start? I think if you look at data mesh and you think about those principles and you think about that platform and that consistency and how you define a data product. So I think if you front load a lot of that work, I think it will then break down the barriers for you when you start using your data. So that's maybe where I would say, well, okay, if you've got something, take a pause. If you've got a green field, let's front load that platform,
Mm.
that setup, the infrastructure. Um, let's front load that data product definition. Let's think about what your data domains actually are, or the business that you have. And if we can just figure that out to begin with, I think that people and process problem is maybe the hardest part. Do that first, and the technical stuff will catch up, or it will get there. And I mean, I've worked with massive multinational customers, and they can't even agree what their data domains are, because they're just so vast that
Yeah, yeah,
trying to define who owns what and where it is, and coming up with an organization hierarchy for, say, your org dimension in your Kimbal model. They can't even get that right sometimes with country and region and operating company and department. Sometimes even figuring out the internals of a data domain becomes a challenge. So I think, my advice would be try and front load some of that
mm,
business orientated stuff, which then will make the technical journey a lot easier.
yeah. So, and what happens to these other terms that we've been talking about, like data lakehouse? Like, how does that play a role? I think I know the answer, but I would like to hear you say it.
My view would be that a Delta Lakehouse or a Data Lakehouse, whatever buzzword we want to use for ACID transactional resilience over some of our data, I think that's technical offering still should exist within our data products. And
Yeah,
we use that transactional resilience as a technical capability in the same way that we have for a relational database. It's just a tool in our toolbox to deliver what we need to deliver with that data. I don't see a lake house as the answer to delivering a data mesh. I see a lake house as part of the offering, as part of what goes into a data product.
yeah, makes
That'll
sense.
be that'll be my answer.
Well, that's what I was thinking too. So that's at least we are aligned. But
Yeah.
yeah, so it's okay. So let's. I think, is there anything we haven't covered about data mesh? I think we kind of glanced over like the actual implementation, because I think we can probably spend like another 5 hours talking about like, okay, how do you do security? How do you do compliance? How do you do? But I mean, they are part of the principles. We talked about the data part right now, and that's of course obviously very important for a lot of our users who want to use Power BI, who want to use Spark, who want to use these things. But as we've seen with Power BI, the only time when organizations, IT, compliance teams become comfortable with them doing self-service BI is when we can tell them a good story around, of course, we make sure there's no data leakage. We make sure that we understand who's using high confidential data. So probably that's the same with data mesh, right? That compliance security part is where you can convince the organization, hey, it's okay that we have this data federated.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a governance argument to make there with doing that. If you have that good governance in place, it means people can relax a little bit more.
Yeah,
Um, I do also think there's a scale here that too much governance means that it becomes too difficult to do anything, and maybe not enough governance means it's a bad thing. So there's definitely part of that, but I think something that perhaps we've not touched on yet with data mesh is about the reduction in that hyper specialized skill in what we're seeing in the industry at the moment, with that massive demand for data engineers and data architects. I think there's elements there that the mesh could deliver, which means we're no longer dependent on that skill set. I'm not saying it's obsolete, certainly not, but I use the analogy of a car. A car I think is used lots of times, but I say an engineer has designed and built a car. I don't need to be an engineer to drive the car. The car has steering wheel and pedals, and I can drive a car using a simplified set of levers and things. That means that the engineer's done the hard part. I can now just drive the car, and I see, I think, some of that in there as well. That there's the governance part, but then there's the abstraction that makes it easy for that self-service person to not worry about Spark, not worry about the Delta Lake, not worry about the infrastructure. They can just drive the car in the sense of getting the data they need. So I think there's that persona sort of abstraction in there as well. The data engineers build the mesh and they build the foundations, the platform, and it means that that specialized engineering skill set could facilitate a whole range of less technical business analysts, business users, whatever we want to call them. It facilitates them doing that, and I think that kind of comes to the scalability side of it as well. That you're unlocking that potential, and to circle back, it's both governance and it's abstraction that means it's possible for a less technical user.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, so on the previous podcast, I was talking to, again, the ABN AMRO team. And one of the things that they did is they have data contracts with their users. So as part of the governance, they say, well, you have to sign this data contract. You're responsible for a lot of these things. And when that trust is there within the organization, it becomes easier. Instead of like, no, we don't trust anyone with anything. Like, then you will never be able to scale, like you were saying. The scalability part is gone. But if you sign that contract and say, well, okay, I know what I'm doing, and because it also gives you awareness, I know what I'm doing, and I can do this. Things become much better. So I think, again, I see this as we started with self-service in the BI world, but now we're starting to get more self-service on the underlying architecture, the underlying data sets, and because there are more demands in this area. So I really like this.
Yeah, Zhamak describes it in her book as socio-technical, which is social technical. The mash of those two words, and I think it's a good way to describe it. That coming together of people, process, and technical offerings, which means that we can let our guard down if we have that understanding.
All right, that makes a ton of sense. So what did we not cover yet that we should cover around data mesh?
It's such a big area. I think I would like to say just the acceptance that we are still figuring this out. I don't think we have all of the answers yet. I think our data mesh is maybe our North Star of what we want to move towards and what we want to deliver for our customers. It has a very high barrier to entry, but it has a lot of potential and a lot of richness that can come out of it. I don't think anybody has delivered a perfect data mesh solution yet. Certainly not that I'm aware of. I've helped some of my customers do it, and I'm working with one at the moment to do it. But it's very subjective. It's very down to the business's view and where the business wants to take it. And that once we then start figuring that out and weaving in all of the technical elements to it, I think just that acceptance of it's hard, it's okay, we will figure it out together.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. All right, cool. Well, I think that's a good way, good segue into like closing it off. I think, yeah, we have lots more to talk about. Probably in a few months from now, 6 to 12 months, we should probably do a follow-up, see where we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will definitely put your whole blogs into the description. The SQL bit session I can probably put into the description too. I think it's public.
Yeah, I think if the recording is available there now, then yeah, I think that's also another good way to think about it. And yeah, hopefully in 6 months that minimum viable mesh maybe will be a little clearer on, certainly.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good videos and podcasts. I was listening in preparation for this because I'm also interested in this topic. I was listening to it. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of sessions. I saw someone else also from the ThoughtWorks team that did so how do you implementing data mesh in Azure too, with pros and cons and things that didn't work as well and the things that worked as well. So as you said, we still have to figure it out, but I think the benefits and it's very interesting for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, Paul, thank you so much for your time. I'd love to get you back, as I said, a little bit later on to see where we are and what we've learned in all these times. And with that, I want to really, really thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kasper. Thanks for having me again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And that concludes another episode of Kasper On BI. I hope it was interesting. I learned a lot. I think it was a good conversation talking about what is data mesh, how does it help us. There's a lot to figure out here yet, but I do think it is really an interesting area to investigate. More and more, we're seeing different types of users who want to be able to use their data for their Python, for their Spark, for building Power BI reports. So there's all these different types of users inside of the organizations who we want to build that data culture for. We want to enable them to get to data in a governed and secure way, obviously, which is important. And I think data mesh is really, really, really interesting. And again, the analogy that we had before, talking about microservices / a service bus, as we talked about it 15, 20 years ago in the development world, makes a lot of sense here. So I will leave a lot of the descriptions, a lot of the links, and a lot of the follow-up reading material in the description below. We're not there yet. Again, I hope in 6 to 12 months, we'll do a follow-up to this discussion and see where we are then. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.